second Peter's comments and thanking you for joining us this evening. Our guest tonight is Dr. Michael Rectenwald. He has a PhD in literary and cultural studies from Carnegie Mellon University. He's a cultural pundit, free speech advocate, and prolific writer. He's the author of 9 books, including The Google Archipelago, The Digital Gulag in Simulation of Freedom, and Springtime for Snowflakes. Both of these books are available for purchase at the back table from our bookstore. So if you're interested in his ideas and want to read more, I'm sure he'd be happy to autograph them for you. They make great Valentine's Day gifts. He's also written for many different popular news media outlets, including RT.com, The American Conservative, The Washington Post, and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, as well as appeared on numerous major network television talk shows, such as Fox and Friends, The Tucker Carlson Show, Glenn Beck Show, Barney and Company, The O'Reilly Factor, and many others. In addition, he has taught at New York University, Duke University, Carnegie Mellon, Case Western Reserve University. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Rectenwald.
Daniel, can everybody hear me? Is that good? Okay, great. Thanks for coming, everybody. Thanks for the introduction, Daniel. And I will, first of all, I want to note that the title is different than advertised slightly. Nevertheless, I wanted to keep woke capitalism in there because I think that might be the draw. But I'm going to start with talking about totalitarianism with communist characteristics, which is a play on the Chinese system, corporate socialism, and woke capitalism. So we're going to have a slideshow to go along with my talk. I'll read and talk, and then we'll answer questions at the end. Several decades ago, when China's growing reliance on the for-profit sectors of its economy could no longer be credibly denied by the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, its leadership approved the slogan, "Socialism with Chinese Characteristics," to describe the Chinese economic system. Formulated by Deng Xiaoping, the phrase became an essential figure of the CCP's attempt to rationalize the Chinese capitalist development. The growing capitalization of the Chinese economy was to be a temporary phase, lasting as long as 100 years, according to some party leaders, or long enough to make sure they were dead before it ended, on the way to a classless society of full communism. The party leaders claimed and still maintain that socialism with Chinese characteristics is a temporary phase of socialist development peculiar to China and necessary, particularly in China's case, because China was a backward agrarian country when communism was introduced. Too early, it was implied. China needed a capitalist booster shot. Stripped of its socialist ideological pretensions, socialism with Chinese characteristics, or the Chinese system itself, really amounts to a socialist state increasingly funded by capitalist economic development. And you can see here, I don't know if it's, you have, this is a cartoon of, what is this cartoon? The Simpsons, yes. This is Lisa from The Simpsons. Wait, don't be fooled. The capitalist mode of production is still present, which is something a communist would say about China. And this is Stalin, of course, saying, but it's got a red flag, which is to say that it has a socialist rhetorical flourishes to accompany it. But it really amounts to a socialist state fueled by a capitalist economy. Whether the CCP believers believe their own rhetoric or not, the ideological gymnastics on display are nevertheless spectacular. That is to say, on its face, The slogan, socialism with Chinese characteristics, embeds and glosses over a ludicrously obvious contradiction in an attempt to re-communize the Chinese capitalist development as a precondition of full communism. However, the slogan does capture an essential truth about socialism, communism. And I'm going to use the phrase socialism, communism with a hyphen in between because there was no distinction for Marx and Engels between the two. And then Lenin introduced that socialism as a stage of communism. So I'm sort of embedding both meanings in one. This essential truth was either unrecognized or unacknowledged by the CCP and denied by Western Marxists, and they still exist. Maybe we have some here. Contrary to its proponents, socialism is not economic at base. That's going to be a bold claim, but I'm going to back up. It is not the abolition of private property and the establishment of economic equality, which are impossibilities in any case. At its most advanced stage, socialism, communism is a political takeover of the state by socialist leaders under the pretext of the abolition of private property and the establishment of economic equality. Ever since the horrors of Soviet repression reached the West, Western Marxists began to use the term state capitalism to describe the former Soviet Union. Because China maintains state-directed capitalist sectors today, Western Marxists have suggested that the term applies even more demonstrably to present-day China. Western Marxists employ the term state capitalism to exclude the Soviet Union and China from the category socialism, communism. And you may have heard this, oh, that wasn't communism, oh, that wasn't communism, oh, that wasn't communism. It's never communism, according to the socialist communists. But according to me, it is. And that is, they are wrong. Both the Chinese Communist Party and the Western Marxists are wrong to suggest that, first of all, in the case of China, that economic socialism will evolve from capitalist development. That's an absurdity. Further, they're wrong because this is the extent to which socialism can possibly develop and survive. It is the ultimate stage of socialism, communism. And the Western Marxists are wrong because China's exploitation of capitalist economic development does not preclude the possibility of Chinese socialism, not in the future and not now. It's not that China may yet evolve into full socialism and communism. It is fully socialist and communist as such. Once in power, the socialist leaders recognize that given their control of resources, they have effectively become the new owners of the means of production. Whereas, as Ludwig von Mises suggested, it would be more accurate to say that consumers effectively hold the power of economic disposal in free markets. That is, you as a consumer determine what is made and how much is made by virtue of your demand. This may have been the secret ambition of the socialist leaders. After all, however much they fooled themselves and others into thinking otherwise. Thus, the economic pretensions of socialism, communism are jettisoned as capitalist development is introduced and cleverly rationalized, as in China, or if the pretensions are maintained for long, they wreck society, as in the former Soviet Union. In either case, the socialist leadership will learn that wealth production requires the accumulation of privately held capital, whether they understand why or not. Thus, the limit of socialism, communism is a political arrangement. Why is this? Ludwig von Mises pointed to the reasons for this necessity in his discussions of the calculation problem. Now, if you just extrapolate from what he says, without prices, the value of the factors of production, or the means of production and the elements that go into production, are indeterminable. So there's no way to know what to make, how much of it, and so on, and what it's worth. So irrationality and chaos ensue. But prices depend on and are necessary for exchange. and exchange presupposes markets, and markets presuppose property relations, and property relations presuppose private property, and private property presupposes persons who possess property. Therefore, wealth production depends on persons possessing private property. You can't have wealth production without persons possessing private property. But socialism depends on these political arrangements, and what are they? Totalitarian, they must be. Why? Simply because the state must decide on matters of production, distribution, and consumption absent prices. And then this leads to the assertion of the state over itself. Marx's assertion that the state would, quote, wither away is absurd. The state must be maintained at all costs, and without it, monopoly production cannot be ensured, because if nothing else, socialism, communism is a monopoly production. It's a monopolization over the means of production. Despite the idea that everybody owns it, so to speak, under the ideal construction, it's always state-controlled because you can't have everybody owning anything, and for reasons that are obvious, but I'll talk about further. Furthermore, economic democracy and economic equality, the two things that are proposed and promised, are impossible. Therefore, and I'm sorry if you have any fans here. In the absence of prices, economic democracy is subverted by the Jeremiads against economic equality, the rhetoric of its usually unwitting political dupes, like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez today, for example, function as chimeras, diversionary tactics, lost leaders, ruses, the bait in an eventual bait and switch scheme. They find themselves, and then even the socialist leaders, if they are true believers and not cynics, and some are cynics, Trotsky was a cynic, I think, are on the other end of a bait and switch scheme. They find themselves forced into it as circumstances unravel. Thus, it follows, if there's anyone seeking to ward off or combat socialism, communism, they should understand what it is they oppose. They don't oppose a propertyless society or economic equality. They don't oppose these things that a classless society that are preached about and promised. They oppose actually existing communism. And that's a phrase that's been used by the communist dissidents since the Soviet Union to refer to the way things really are and not as they are promised in the ideal texts. It is a political system buttressed by ideological and political force. It is not a viable economic system, and therefore economic socialism, communism remains forever ideological. That is to say, it's merely a false version. To use Marx's notion of ideology, Marx suggested that ideological formations are actually upside-down, inverted versions of reality. Let's take Marx and flip him on his head. Again, he flipped Hegel on his head, so we're going to flip him back. Enter corporate socialism. Now, what I'm arguing here today is not that we're headed into a Soviet or Chinese system at all. But nevertheless, a socialist sequel may be coming to a theater near you. The same old characters are reappearing while new ones have joined the cast. While the ideology and rhetoric sound nearly the same, they're being put to different ends. This time around, the old bromides and promises are in play, and a similar but identical bait and switch is dangled, but a new variety is on the docket. This new variety is corporate socialism. The contemporary variant is corporate socialism. First bullet point to the left, which is a two-tiered system of actually existing socialism on the ground, coupled by and paralleled by a set of corporate monopolies on top. The difference between state socialism and corporate socialism is merely that a different constituency effectively controls the means of production, but both depend on monopoly and both depend on the state to a different degree. One is the state and the other the corporate monopolization of the economy. And both depend on socialist communist ideology or of democratic socialism and, in the current variety, social justice or woke ideology. So woke ideology is an ideological formation on the ground to prepare for and habituate people to the consequences of corporate socialism. Corporate socialism is the desired end, while democratic socialism and woke capitalism are among the means. How could socialist ideology possibly become hegemonic in the US, of all places, you may ask, such that corporate socialism might be introduced, however gradually? Why and how could a socialist ideology attain dominance in the world's most capitalist country? First, as I've stated, actually existing socialism is essentially political, a system attained and maintained largely by means of an extremely alluring yet deceptive political ideology. Second, the received notion that all capitalists favor, quote, right-wing ideology. This is the typical statement of a leftist. Oh, no. There's no way the left would ever abet capitalism. No. Because capitalists favor right-wing ideology because right-wing ideology best represents their interests. But this is mistaken and historically disproven, as I'll show. Third, corporate socialists abjure and condemn free market economics, as you'll see. I'm not just making assertions, but I'm putting up the thesis first, and then I'll back it up with evidence. They condemn free market economics and manage to rally a significant contingent of the population to oppose it as well. How do they do this and why? Fourth, did I say three? Yeah. Fourth, socialist ideology continues to have purchase because it has not been required to atone for its criminal past, despite the death toll of 94 million in the combined communist countries. Somehow, socialism has walked scot-free into the future. It has managed, although racking up 94 million dead and many more imprisoned, rather than receiving its deserved opprobrium, it has passed through the 20th and into the 21st century like a defeated yet somehow dignified old man. Okay, so, nevertheless, the specter of socialism, by the way, if you recognize that language, the specter of communism, or specter of that's how the Communist Manifesto started off. A specter is haunting Europe. That specter was communism. Yet the specter not only stirs the fantasies of subterranean socialist communist milieus, those holdouts from the communist left of yore, of which I used to be one, but it also appeals to those less educated in socialist communist theory and history who nevertheless maintain a disgruntled and abject posture with reference to possibilities. They are mostly millennialists and millennials in one. Millennialists and millennials in one. And what I mean by that is millennialism. Does anybody know what millennialism is? It is the prospect in Christianity of the 1,000-year reign of Christ after his return in the second coming. Millennialism refers to the idea of this heralding of a new utopia that will last forever. And so socialism has this millennialism about it. Very religious in content. That brings us, so here's the idea, heaven on earth, right? This is like the millennial ambition or hope for the return of Christ. In that case, the return, in the socialist formulation, it's the working class who plays the role of Christ, in effect, bringing and heralding in the new revolution and the second coming, if you will, and the paradise on earth. This leads us to wokeness, woke capitalism. So now we're going to get more contemporary. Then I'll jump back and in the past. This is wokeness. Are you getting more woke as you look? So getting closer. The ideological needs of corporate socialism explain the introduction of the contemporary prevalence of woke capitalism. I've written about woke capitalism earlier and elsewhere, but I'll summarize what I've said before, but also add a few new insights. coined by the New York Times columnist Roth, who thought, woke capitalism refers to a burgeoning wave of companies that have become socially and politically conscious. Some major corporations now intervene in social and political issues and controversies, partaking in a new corporate activism. I'm sure you've heard of this, and you'll see what I'm talking about if you haven't. Woke capitalism has endorsed Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, contemporary feminism, LGBTQ rights and concerns, immigration activists, and other causes. Woke capitalism has included woke advertising, such as the Nike campaign featuring Colin Kaepernick, Gillette's We Believe ad, otherwise known as the best a man can get, or the toxic masculinity ad, which I have shredded in another instance, but I won't go into here. And more recently, the menstruation ad from the feminine, not women's, feminine underwear company, Thinx. And this is the ad. This is a clip from the ad right there. Not a clip, but a screen cap from the ad, where there's obviously a masculine figure holding a tampon, because men can have periods too. That's the claim of the ad. There have been a few explanations for this phenomenon. That is woke capitalism. One is it's a way of appeasing workers and consumers. The story goes the consumers are leftist leaning because most of them are on the coasts. They have a left to liberal politics, and therefore the advertising assuages them, makes them feel included, and the company gets rewarded with sales and brand loyalty. In the case of Black Lives Matter, the NFL player Kaepernick's ad really did help boost Nike's sales, and that would seem to support Josh Barro's theory from the Business Insider. Duthought, the gentleman from the Times who coined the phrase woke capitalism, he offers a different explanation. Basically, the ads appease the consumer bases and political contingents, but they only do it in order to ingratiate themselves to the politicos, in the liberal politicos in the government, political figures who then act in the favor of these corporations. You know, maybe, for example, initiating antitrust legislation to stop them from monopolizing, just to institute legislation that favors their interests. Now, I have a problem with these explanations because they don't explain just why a corporation would embrace leftist politics. Historically, the left and corporations have been an antagonistic relationship. This goes back to the 60s and before. There's a history of antagonism between these two. Now, contemporary corporations are apparently embracing, in a love embrace with this leftism. Now, how in the heck can we explain this? And not only are they assuaging their customer bases, they're also maybe making them more leftist. They're promoting leftism through woke advertising and woke activism. Arguably, corporations would not espouse and potentially spread political views merely to assuage consumer or political contingents, unless the views aligned with their own interests, and especially not if they oppose their interests. One is led, therefore, to wonder what politics would best serve the interests of those corporations, and would woke capitalism directly represent those interests? Is that a possibility? Could it be that these interests actually line up? And I argue they do. To benefit corporate global interests, monopolies, a political creed, would likely promote the free movement of labor and goods across national borders, and thus it would be internationalist rather than nationalist or nativist. And that has been the case for the left and it is also the case for the corporate interests. It might seek to produce and promote new niche markets, and thus would benefit from a politics that encourages the continual splintering of identity categories and the introduction of new identity types. Likewise, it might welcome and encourage gender pluralism, transgenderism, and other identity morphisms. The more the merrier, more niche markets are possible. Also, this identity pluralism, and this has been an argument of the hardcore socialist left, identity politics and pluralism prevents the solidarity of the workers in their collective bargaining. That might be a benefit to corporations as well. And the disruption of stable gender categories has the potential to erode and eventually contribute to the dismantling of the family, or possibly the last bastion of influence between the social body and the state/corporate power. Ultimately and potentially, the globalist corporation would benefit from a singular globalized governmental monopoly with one set of rules, and thus would promote a borderless internationalism under a global government, otherwise known as one worldism, and that has been the objective of the left forever. Internationalism has been the slogan of leftism since Marx. Contemporary woke leftism hastens the dissolution of heretofore stable social ontologies, historical memory, inherited culture, Christianity, the nation state, all those things you've come to despise since you've come to college. It also aims at one world monopoly government. Thus, woke leftist politics align almost perfectly with the global interests of monopolistic corporations. Lest you think this is all completely fabricated out of thin air, let's go back in time. We're going to talk about the prototypical corporate socialist. Corporate socialism has a fairly long history, with its first formal expressions dating to the late 19th century in the US. Over a series of astonishing and controversial book-length contributions, the late historian and Hoover Institute fellow Anthony C. Hutton argued that corporate socialists contributed both theoretically and materially to several 20th century political economies, corporate socialist political economies, including state socialism, communism in Russia, the New Deal in the US, fascism in Italy, and National Socialism, or Nazism, in Germany. In Wall Street and FDR, one of his 3 books on the topic, he wrote a trilogy. I don't have all 3 covers here. This book is a compilation of them. He discussed the businessmen and financiers who turned into political economists and wrote books extolling the virtues of corporate socialism and opposing them to the evils of the free market. Yes, the free market was absolutely vilified by these major corporate players. Leading Sutton's list was this guy named Frederick Clemson Howe, who published, you mentioned Confessions of an Entrepreneur, who published Confessions of a Monopolist in 1906. Sutton took Howe to be the prototypical corporate socialist monopolist, and the first to espouse these principles in a book-length treatise, although it was an autobiography. However, I've pointed out that Frederick Howe was hardly a monopolist, and Confessions of a Monopolist was not the autobiography of an actual monopolist, but rather a piece of biting satire, a fictional autobiography, narrated by a fictional monopolist, critical of monopolies and monopolists. This is a lesson in historiography. Don't buy secondary sources on the word. You dig deeper and see what the actual source is doing and look around, because Sutton was duped and he was a good historian. Nevertheless, Sutton does cite a handful of actual corporate socialists, authors whom, with Howe, he figures as having provided the theoretical basis of the New Deal. Sutton's corporate socialist tribe includes Max and Paul Warburg, Bernard Baruch, Otto Kahn, Robert S. Brookings, and George W. Perkins. Sutton characterizes the treatises of these authorial businessmen as follows. 2 themes are common in these Wall Street literary efforts. Literary is a bit of an overshot, I think, about how I would refer to these books. No offense, business people, but they're not actually literary, I got to tell you. First, that individualism and individual effort and individual initiative are out of date, and that destructive competition, usually termed blind competition or dog-eat-dog competition, is outmoded and unwanted and destructive of human social ideals. Second, we can identify a theme that follows from this attack on individualism and competition to the effect that great advantages accrue from cooperation. Cooperation advances technology, and cooperation prevents the wastes of competition. It is then concluded by these financier philosophers, what a phrase, that trade associations and ultimately economic planning, or in other words, enforced cooperation, are the prime objective for responsible and enlightened modern businessmen. And they formed what are called trusts, and I'm sure you business students know what a trust is. You probably know better than I do what a trust is. And trusts were the way they ventured to produce this cooperation, which meant collusion amongst themselves and the state, with the state. Yet, Sutton missed or overlooked the actual prototypical businessman who was the first overt advocate of corporate socialist monopolism, as far as I can tell, and woke capitalism for that matter, none other than King Camp Gillette. Gillette, the same who founded the Gillette American Safety Razor Company in 1901 and changed its name to the Gillette Safety Razor Company in 1902, the same company that chastised its customers for their toxic masculinity. It comes by its wokeness quite honestly. Gillette published 3 books espousing corporate socialism. One, The Human Drift in 1894, well ahead of Howe, World Corporation in 1910, and the People's Corporation in 1924. He also managed and financed the contents of 2 other books. This is the frontispiece of The Human Drift, the first book. And as you can see, he has the phrase here, material equality, united intelligence. And the world is a diamond in the rough, and intellect, the only progressive entity, must cut the facets to discover its beauty and power. Progressivism was on the rise. This was the progressive movement, the progressive era, and he was a leading corporate socialist. He was the first, as far as I can tell. And as you can see, material equality was his aim. This is the guy that founded the Gillette Razor Company, one of the best known and one of the corporations with, as great a brand recognition, name brand recognition as you can expect or hope for. Gillette's Human Drift railed against competition, which the razor blade maker believed was the prolific source of ignorance and every form of crime, and that which increases the wealth of the few at the expense of the many. The present system of competition between individuals results in fraud, deception, and the adulteration of almost every article we eat, drink, or wear. Competition, he continued, resulted in, quote, a waste of material labor beyond calculation. Not to be outdone by later corporate socialist competitors, Gillette laid every evil known to man at the door of this wonderful system of cooperation, quote unquote. Not only was competition the root of selfishness, war between nations and individuals, murder, robbery, lying, prostitution, forgery, divorce, deception, brutality, ignorance, injustice, drunkenness, insanity, suicide, and every other crime. Besides crime, 90% of all sickness is directly attributable to this senseless competition, such as sickness being caused by worry, anxiety, care, forced living conditions, and crowded and filthy tenements, insufficient and coarse food, unstable and insufficient clothing, and forced condition of overwork and exposure. God, help us. This is the way he pictured his constituents, the future beneficiaries of corporate socialism. This is the frontispiece of a book written by Martin Severi, who wrote for him under his aegis and wrote this book called Gillette's Social Redemption. As you can see, these people are in misery and fear. The full title is Gillette's Social Redemption, a review of worldwide conditions as they exist today, offering an entirely new suggestion for the remedy of the evils they exhibit. One wonders why Gillette ventured to put razor blades in the hands of such people who suffered under the yoke of dreaded competition. Perhaps his books were meant as preventative medicines, meant to keep them from cutting their own throats. The antidote for human suffering, though, would be a singular monopoly, a monopoly that would naturally control all production and distribution, specializing in everything, such that, quote, every article sold to consumer, from the package to its contents, will be the product of United Company from raw material. Under the United Company, the production of necessary goods and eventually everything would be consolidated and centralized, eliminating the wastes and hazards of the many and widely dispersed manufacturing plants and buildings of the current haphazard and chaotic system. Most cities and towns would be, quote, destroyed, as would all competitors, quote unquote, and the vast majority of the population would relocate to the metropolis, where, powered by Niagara Falls, all production would take place and everyone's lives would center around the corporation whose commercial and governmental power would be total. Gillette's, in case you're wondering, those film buffs out there, yes, Gillette's Metropolis was suggested for Fritz Lang's movie, The Metropolis of 1927, the science fiction masterpiece, I think, by the same name. As in Gillette's Metropolis, the sidewalks of Lang's Metropolis were figured as transparent. Gillette made his prospective sidewalks transparent so that workers laboring beneath the buildings dealing with plumbing and other infrastructure would have light. But also, he wanted the city residents to see people at work below their feet, to feel their privilege and the lack of privilege of the workers. The idea was to prevent people from forgetting about all the essential work that goes into making a city and to make it run. But unlike Gillette's Metropolis, Lang's was a horrific dystopia. And therefore, I think Lang is mistakenly blamed for being a socialist utopian. I think he says, this is Gillette's ideal. This ideal is a nightmare. His transparency, allowing workers to be seen, showed them in isolated cubicles and spaces of alienated labor. Next, after inventing the safety razor blade and founding a company to produce and sell it, Gillette went on to write and publish World Corporation, in which he extended the United Company of Human Drift to the globalized, singular monopoly that would undertake all production for the entire world and serve as a one-world government. As for the capitalist hiatus between his corporate socialist books, as Gillette's biographer put it, quote, it was almost as if Karl Marx had paused between the Communist Manifesto, 1848, and Das Kapital, 1872, to develop a dissolving toothbrush or collapsible comb. While Gillette never mentioned Marx or Marxism in his writing, passages in World Corporation closely echo Marxist understanding of history as class struggle. Like Marx, Gillette believed that the fundamental opposition between owners and servants must inevitably be resolved. For Marx, the contradiction would be overcome with the expropriation of a few usurpers by the mass of the people. In other words, take their property from them. According to Marx, take it back. For Gillette, it would be surpassed through the process of capitalist incorporation itself. Like Marx, Gillette believed that capital accumulation tended inexorably towards conglomeration and monopoly, but the answer for Gillette was to establish a world corporation and offer stockholding to the masses, sort of like Merrill Lynch to the nth degree, along with the continuous buying out of large stockholders until all stock was held in equal shares by all the denizens of the world. This process would end in socialism. Corporations. will continue to form, absorb, expand, and grow, and no power of man can prevent it. Promoters of incorporation are the true socialists of this generation. Do I sound like Bernie Sanders? The actual builders of a cooperative system, which is eliminating competition and in a practical business way, reaching the results which socialists have vainly tried to attain through legislation and agitation for centuries. To complete the industrial evolution and establish a system of equity only requires a belief in the truth stated herein and the support of World Corporation. And the book actually took up contributions to get it off the ground. Opposition to World Corporation, he said, by individual states or governments will all be of no avail. There's no use opposing this. Opposition in any case can only be temporary, in effect. Barriers will only centralize power and cause increased momentum when they give way. You resist this at your own peril, and you actually abet the movement of the World Corporation if you oppose it. Now, while clearly Gillette's World Corporation did not come to pass as such, his business practices did benefit from monopolistic tendencies. Some argued with me about this next claim. He regularly took out patents, which are limited monopolies, I think. And in 1917, with the outbreak of World War I, the company provided every soldier in the U.S. with a shaving kit paid for by the U.S. government. Collusion. The Gillette Razor Company may also be one of the first, if not the first company to have engaged in woke advertising. In a 1905 full-color 3x5-inch postcard advertisement featured a cherubic infant holding a razor, his face half covered with shaving cream. Now, why is he putting a razor in the hands of an infant? Well, there's a reason. This text at the top says, begin early, shave yourself. The ad subtly proposed a new kind of manhood, surprise. Already in 1906, the Gillette Company was challenging conventional toxic masculinity and proposing, in effect, this other type of masculinity that did not put one's needs on somebody else. In other words, the object lesson here was that a man was potentially responsible for shaving himself. The lesson was that from infancy on, men take care of themselves rather than putting the burden on their fellow man and, in short, reducing them to a kind of slavery. Already, we have this idea that he's going so far as to put a razor in a child's hand to show that people should start shaving from infancy on, although I see not why. But anyway, because certainly they have no toxic stubble yet. Finally, this foregoing discussion certainly should convince the reader of the existence of corporate socialism, at least as it was developed historically. It is important to note that corporate socialism has come much closer to fruition than any theoretical socialism, communism developed by Marx. That's because the latter, despite its other problems, does maintain private property in the factors of production, at least until their ownership is completely subsumed by the people, which never happens and can't. Today, woke capitalism uses socialist and social justice ideology to promote the kind of top-tier monopolization of production with the promise of equality for everyone else, common to both actually existing Marxist and corporate socialism. Thank you. Here we have my trilogy on social justice, my first book on this topic, Springtime for Snowflakes, available in the back. Google Archipelago, also available in the back. And the next forthcoming book, Beyond Woke.
We have time for some comments, so if you have a question, please raise your hand. I'll come around with the mic. Also remember that his books are on sale at the back, so
I think you'll find them amusing at least.
Yep.
You mentioned National Socialism in Germany. Can you talk a little more about that, particularly since the left always tries to portray National
That is
Socialism
the right-wing
as a
movement.
right-wing movement, where in fact the true National Socialist ideologues were very proletariat-oriented and really saw themselves as rivals to the communists for the loyalty to the proletariat,
Yeah.
bourgeois, et cetera.
It's easier to talk about it from the, and my knowledge base is greater in terms of Italy and the rise of fascism with a capital F, and that was historically, and it's precisely locatable, that the fascist movement grew out of the Marxist syndicalist movement and the nationalist movement and the combination thereof. They were both collectivist at base. Fascist, F-A-S-C-E-S, means bundle. It is a collectivist ideology through and through. And so fascism has its roots in socialism. I mean, this is a fact. Now, it's suborned and also, it sort of overtook those roots as well, but it's definitely coming from there. And what they did in Italy was take the working class, which was supposedly the agent of history, the proletariat, and they turned Italy, they figured it as a proletariat state. So they turned the class war into a national war, an internationalist war of the state against other states, Italy competing against the other states for supremacy, or at least competitive advantage. It wasn't necessarily imperialist at all at first. In fact, it was more or less defensive in posture. As for Nazism, I mean, it's called National Socialism, of course. I mean, it took obviously elements from Marxism in order to appeal to the workers and also broader population in order to produce, and it had tenets that actually promoted socialism within the nation as against the internationalism of Marxism. The nation proved to be much more viable as a way of cohering people with each other as against classes. Classes didn't work. I mean, people just did not see any kind of coherence between themselves and people in other states, other nation states. They just didn't see it. So the internationalism has not paid out, has not come to pass.
Could you talk a little bit more about some of the themes that are in your second book on big tech?
Big tech and Google Archipelago, sure.
Particularly in the context of the story that you've been telling,
yeah.
Some people find it surprising that much of the criticism nowadays of the big tech companies is coming from people who identify on the right,
yeah.
who claim that the tech companies are biased against particular viewpoints. Mm-hmm. It's somewhat surprising to see, people who normally defend companies, defend the free market, calling for greater antitrust or regulation or requiring them to have viewpoint balance and so forth. How does that fit into your overall thesis?
Yeah, it fits into this idea that I'm talking about this Google Archipelago, which is of course a play on Gulag Archipelago, the trilogy by Solzhenitsyn, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was a Gulag prisoner for 8 years. The point here is that I'm saying that this concatenation of corporate entities is working in collusion with the state, and as such they're extending and augmenting state power through their technologies. And they are, because they're controlling a massive space of discourse like cyberspace, where everything relevant, almost everything relevant takes place, without which you have no significant vocal power or reach. They are determining what is allowable to be said and what isn't. And they're unpersoning people, disappearing people, as the Gulag did in the Soviet Union. They're disappearing them from public life. And it amounts to a social death. So that's why I call it the Google Archipelago. And they are, of course, very biased. I argue that they're a leftist authoritarianism through and through. Their whole orientation is leftism. It's authoritarian leftism. And it tends towards the kinds of control and disappearance of any kind of opposition to their views. We see this with many people being just unpersoned on the web. Furthermore, the biases of Google have been exposed enormously. I mean, their left-leaning biases are outrageous. Some people would say, well, you don't have to use Google, but Google's more than a search engine. It is actually constructing the infosphere itself. They're actually determining what the knowledge base is, what the infosphere contains. So they're not strictly disseminating information based on searches. They're actually producing the infosphere from which people draw information, and they're constructing it in such a way as to tilt it towards particular objectives and tendencies. Does that make sense? Well, I don't propose like regulations, because regulations only raise the cost of entry and make for more monopolization. So I propose actually legal. I do propose legal measures like suits, class action suits against their prejudice and bias, and like Tulsi Gabbard, for example, is suing Google, and I think that's the kind of move. But we need more people, like in a collective, to form a class action suit against them, but also to produce alternate infospheres continually and without remission, because unless we have alternatives to the narratives that they're pushing, there will be no other narratives, and they're really pushing certain narratives and disappearing other narratives from history. And they're also erasing history too. I'm very familiar with one of the major whistleblowers from Google, Zach Voorhees. Whatever other politics he has, which I don't necessarily agree with, he has exposed a lot of stuff, and he unveiled hundreds of pages of documents showing the leftist biases and tilting and unpersoning and disappearing of information and so on and so forth. But I suggest, first of all, we need to combat their narratives with other ones, but sue them and challenge them and support other structures.
So my question to you is, I know they recently did a lot of investigations into big tech firms from
Yeah.
the FTC over antitrust stuff. How do you think that's going to play into the commentary?
That's a good question. Yeah, the investigations will probably unveil their definite monopoly tendencies, or would-be monopolistic tendencies. But the thing is, like, there's some things that, from their very basis, that are not going to really come out. Or if they do come out, I mean, they're already known. For example, they were funded by the CIA and NSA in the first place, Google, for example. And so therefore, they've always had statist connections. Similarly, Facebook has statist connections, and they have collusion. So there's an ingratiation between the corporations and the state. And as long as that can persist, they're not going to be exposed to the extent necessary. The state does, they're doing the state's bidding and vice versa, basically. It's hand in glove. There's another book called Surveillance Capitalism. I suggest mine over that. I call it Google Marxism instead of surveillance capitalism, because the leftist tendencies are very clear.
So my question is kind of like a side question.
Sure.
I think it's safe to assume you wouldn't be a fan of Gillette. Safe to assume. Would you say you're like a Dollar Shave guy kind of thing, or kind of what?
Chic. No, I don't know. I mean, I have a problem with shaving in general. I always cut myself, especially when I'm in a hurry. But I don't do boycotts or any of that. I mean, that's leftist collectivist nonsense. I shop at major outlets like Starbucks. I don't feel shamed about it at all. Nobody's going to shame me for what I buy. My buying habits are not some moralistic tale, and I don't buy into it. And nobody wants to know how I came from being a communist to what I am now? So I was basically a left communist, as it's called. That is, I was an advocate of communism, but a critic of Bolshevism, because I said Bolshevism basically inserted the party and the vanguard of the party overall and usurped the role of the working class in the Soviet Union and the Russian Revolution to produce a kind of a totalitarian state. And so I was a left communist, was left of the Bolsheviks, actually. And then when I came out and criticized social justice in 2016 in the fall, the left, because of their sort of anti-Trump resistance frenzy, they attacked me en masse, including the communists, the social justice warriors, the anarchists, everybody, all at once. And I just got a glimpse of their totalitarian character underneath the egalitarian veneer. And I said, oh my God, what have I been doing? It just actually just, you speak of woke, I was woke. I mean, I was beyond woke. And that's exactly what I talk about in the book. It was beyond woke. Beyond the group collectivism, because I realized they were enforcing a collectivist view, and I was actually being required to say the right shibboleths or the right phrases and the right beliefs, and I just couldn't go along with it anymore. Some of the things were absurd, totally like there's 72 genders. I'm sorry, there aren't. Or if there are, they're in somebody's imagination exclusively. So things like that, I just couldn't take it any longer. So I just came out. I came out against them, and then sooner or later, it all started unveiling itself, and I started reading the Austrian School. I started reading Mises and his critique of socialism, and it's devastating. Devastating. It blows it away. I can tell you the books. I have them cited in this paper. So that's how that happened. It's ongoing. It's an ongoing revolution against the revolution. Likewise, I'm anathema on most university campuses. I can only speak to business students. The English departments will have nothing to do with me. Whereas I used to be, a favored son, now I'm anathema. Now I'm a pariah. I mean, it's bizarre. These people are completely, there's no allowance for individual independent thinking. And there's no allowance for variance, and there's no allowance for, when I say diversity, equity, inclusion really means conformity, inequity, and exclusion, because it's conformity to a particular ideological formation, it's inequity for anyone who doesn't conform, and if they have their way, it's exclusion from the entire academy. That's how severe it is. It's very severe. I don't know if it's reached here and to what extent. Thank your lucky stars. This is an abhorrent development. Abhorrent.
If there's no further questions, feel free to leave or stick around, buy a book, have it autographed, and come thank our guests. So thanks for coming, everybody.
Thank you.